"You were never meant for my world," Jason Miller said. And in that single sentence, Emily Carter felt her entire life quietly come to an end. The words were not loud, not dramatic, not even angry. They were calm, precise, final, like a signature pressed onto a document that could not be undone. The sunlight pouring through the glass walls of the Manhattan penthouse made everything look almost unreal, too clean, too perfect for something so irreversible. Emily stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, as if moving too suddenly might break what little dignity remained in the air between them. Jason did not look away from her when he removed the ring, placing it carefully on the marble counter as though returning something that had never truly belonged. "I built a life that requires more than this," he added, his tone controlled, rehearsed, as if he had said these words to himself many times before this moment. There was someone else now, an unspoken presence that did not need to be named to be understood. Emily did not ask questions. She did not plead. She simply nodded once, because something inside her had already accepted what her mind had not yet fully processed. Outside, New York City continued its endless rhythm of movement, sirens in the distance, traffic weaving through steel and glass canyons, but inside that penthouse, everything had gone still. Jason turned away first, adjusting his cufflinks, already stepping into a future that did not include her. "The lawyers will handle the rest," he said without looking back. And then he was gone. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than any argument they had ever had. Emily remained where she was, staring at the space he had occupied just seconds before, as if expecting time itself to rewind. But nothing moved backward, only forward. That night she packed a single suitcase. Not because she had nothing, but because she realized she no longer needed anything that belonged to the version of her life that Jason had defined. The next morning, she checked into a quiet hotel in downtown Chicago under her maiden name, Carter, a name she had not used in years. The city felt different here, colder in a way that was not just about weather but about possibility. Weeks passed, then months. Emily disappeared from the social circles Jason still occupied, from the curated dinners and rooftop events and whispered conversations that once defined her identity. To him, she became a fading chapter, a story already concluded. But what Jason did not see was the quiet rebuilding. Late nights spent studying financial reports, early mornings learning investment structures, long hours sitting across from people who never knew her past, and therefore never doubted her future. And then came Daniel Whitmore. He did not arrive like a storm or a rescue. He arrived like certainty, a man whose presence did not demand attention but naturally held it. He saw her not as someone rebuilt, but as someone becoming. When he first said her name, it was without history attached to it, without judgment or memory, only recognition. And for the first time, Emily did not feel like she was being measured against who she used to be. She was simply present, standing in a world that no longer asked her to shrink. Far away in Manhattan, Jason Miller would one day hear the name Daniel Whitmore, attached to a billion-dollar expansion deal that shifted entire markets. He would hear Emily Carter's name beside it, spoken casually in rooms he was not invited into. And in that moment, long after he believed the story had ended, Jason would finally understand that walking away had not been the end of her world. It had been the beginning of one he was never part of again. 5 years passed in a way that felt almost invisible to anyone who once knew Emily Carter, as if she had simply faded out of one version of the world and quietly rewritten herself into another that no longer required permission to exist. In Chicago, she no longer answered to expectations that once defined her life in Manhattan, and the name Carter slowly began to carry weight in rooms where decisions shaped markets rather than opinions. Her days started before sunrise, often in silence, with reports, financial models, and meetings that stretched across time zones, each one building something she did not yet fully name but instinctively understood. She was no longer someone waiting to be chosen or explained. She was someone who learned how to move numbers, structure deals, and read intentions without needing words spoken aloud. When her name appeared in internal briefings tied to major investment movements, it was never accompanied by explanation, only acknowledgement, as if her presence in that space had become expected rather than surprising. Somewhere along that ascent, Daniel Whitmore became part of her trajectory, not as a rescue but as alignment. He never treated her past as a story worth dissecting, nor her present as something unusual. Instead, he spoke to her as if she had always belonged in the same sentence as power and precision. Their conversations were never loud or performative, often taking place in quiet offices overlooking city skylines, or during late evening reviews of portfolios that carried global implications. Daniel Whitmore was known publicly as a billionaire investor whose influence extended across multiple industries, but privately he moved with a restraint that made people underestimate how much control he actually held. With Emily, there was no need for performance. She did not ask to be introduced, and he did not introduce her as anything other than what she already was becoming. Meanwhile, Jason Miller continued his life in Manhattan, convinced that time had closed the chapter he once shared with her. He remained in familiar circles, attending the same events, shaking hands with people who measured success in predictable ways. Occasionally, he heard fragments of Emily Carter's name attached to unfamiliar conversations, usually followed by mentions of financial expansions or strategic partnerships that did not fit the version of her he remembered. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, a name shared by someone else, someone unrelated to the woman he had once walked away from without hesitation. But the frequency of those mentions began to shift something subtle inside him, like a distant echo he could not fully ignore. One evening, while reviewing guest confirmations for an upcoming Manhattan financial gala, Jason noticed a name listed among the highest-tier attendees: Emily Carter, alongside Daniel Whitmore. The pairing meant nothing in isolation, yet it lingered longer than it should have. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, telling himself it was irrelevant, that names often overlapped in large cities where ambition created intersections without meaning. Still, when he closed his laptop that night, the silence in his apartment felt heavier than usual, as if something unresolved had quietly begun to surface beneath the surface of certainty he had built around his choices. Far away, Emily continued working without awareness of his thoughts, standing at the center of decisions that shaped industries, her world no longer requiring validation from anyone who had once defined her limits. And as invitations were finalized for the gala that would bring the city's most influential figures into one room, neither she nor Jason fully understood that the distance between their past and present was about to collapse into a single evening that neither of them could avoid. The evening of the gala arrived in New York City with a calm that felt almost deceptive, as if the city itself had decided to hold its breath for something important. Inside the grand hall of the Manhattan Financial Center, light from crystal chandeliers spilled across polished marble floors, reflecting in soft golden patterns that moved with every step of arriving guests. Conversations filled the space in controlled waves, each voice carefully measured, each smile practiced in the quiet language of influence. Jason Miller entered with the confidence of a man who believed he still understood the rules of the world he belonged to. He adjusted his suit jacket, greeted familiar faces, and accepted compliments about recent business expansions that reinforced his sense of stability. To him, the evening was another demonstration of presence, another reminder that he had built a life that remained firmly intact. But beneath the surface of polite conversations, something was already shifting in ways he could not yet identify. Across the room, Emily Carter stood beside Daniel Whitmore, her presence calm and unforced, as if she had no need to announce herself in a space that already seemed to recognize her without explanation. She wore simplicity with intention, not as absence of power, but as control over how it was revealed. Daniel Whitmore spoke to her occasionally, not to guide her, but to align with her attention, as though they shared an understanding that did not require translation. When they moved, the room subtly adjusted around them, not because they demanded it, but because influence rarely needed to announce itself loudly. Jason noticed her only after several minutes, not because she was hidden, but because his mind initially refused to place what his eyes were seeing into any familiar category. Emily Carter did not look like a memory. She looked like a conclusion. His steps slowed without conscious decision, conversation fading into background noise as recognition began to form in fragments rather than certainty. He saw her speak briefly to Daniel Whitmore, saw the ease in her posture, the absence of hesitation, and something in that contrast disrupted the quiet confidence he had carried into the room. When Daniel Whitmore finally turned slightly and acknowledged the surrounding guests, the atmosphere around him shifted in a way that was subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself understood hierarchy without needing explanation. Jason moved closer, not because he intended to confront anything, but because distance no longer felt manageable. As he approached, Emily turned her head slightly, and for the first time in years, their eyes met within the same reality. There was no shock in her expression, no visible return of history, only a calm recognition that did not invite interpretation. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but found that no prepared sentence seemed appropriate for what he was witnessing. Before he could find words, Daniel Whitmore stepped forward just enough to close the space between them and the rest of the room, his presence steady and unhurried. "Emily," Daniel said calmly, as if the name itself carried no weight beyond simple acknowledgement, "we should greet the hosts." Then, after a brief pause, he added with quiet clarity, "And I believe you know Jason Miller." The statement was not a question. It was a confirmation placed into the air with precision. Emily looked at Jason then, not with anger, not with nostalgia, but with the kind of calm that no longer required emotional negotiation. Jason felt something inside him shift, not loudly but irreversibly, as if a door he had assumed remained closed had simply ceased to exist in the way he remembered. Around them the gala continued, glasses clinking softly, conversations flowing uninterrupted, but for Jason Miller, the room had narrowed into a single realization he was not prepared to name. Emily Carter was no longer someone he had left behind. She was someone who had continued without him, and far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The silence between Emily Carter and Jason Miller lasted only a few seconds, yet it stretched in Jason's mind like something far longer, as if time itself had slowed to make him fully aware of what he was standing in front of. Around them the gala continued its elegant rhythm, glasses lifted at the right angles, polite laughter exchanged at carefully chosen volumes, but Jason could no longer fully hear any of it. Emily remained composed, her posture unchanged, her expression steady in a way that offered no opening for the past to re-enter. It was not coldness that defined her presence, but completion, as if everything she had once been had already been resolved into something else entirely. Jason forced a small breath, attempting to reassemble the version of himself that had walked into this room only minutes earlier. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than he expected, carrying a hesitation he did not intend to reveal. She looked at him without urgency, without the emotional weight he had subconsciously prepared for. "I did not expect to see you here," he added, as if the statement could anchor the moment back into something familiar. Daniel Whitmore stood beside her without interruption, observing not with judgment, but with quiet awareness, as though he understood that some encounters required no interference to reveal their full weight. Emily's gaze did not waver. "I am here because I was invited," she replied calmly, her voice even and unshaken, carrying neither accusation nor invitation for explanation. Jason nodded slightly, searching for something recognizable in her tone, but finding none of the uncertainty he remembered from years ago. That absence unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Around them, a few nearby guests began to notice the exchange, though no one approached, as if instinctively recognizing that this moment belonged to a different level of attention. Daniel Whitmore finally spoke, his tone measured and controlled. "Jason Miller, I believe your company has recently expanded into West Coast infrastructure investment," he said, shifting the focus away from personal history without dismissing it entirely. Jason turned slightly, almost grateful for the interruption, and responded with practiced professionalism, "Yes, we have been looking at several opportunities in that region." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the response without extending it further. Then with quiet precision he added, "Emily has been directly involved in structuring those financial frameworks through our advisory division." The words landed without emphasis, yet their impact was immediate. Jason's attention returned to Emily, searching for confirmation, for correction, for anything that would restore the boundaries of what he believed was possible. But Emily offered none. Her silence functioned not as absence, but as alignment with the truth already stated. For a brief moment Jason felt the structure of his assumptions shift, not collapsing dramatically, but adjusting in ways that made him question where he had been standing. All along, he had known her as someone defined by proximity, by shared history, by a version of life that had felt finite and contained. But the woman standing before him now existed within a framework he had never been part of. A passing toast nearby broke the tension slightly, but the undercurrent remained unchanged. Jason looked at Emily again, this time more carefully, noticing details he had not allowed himself to see earlier. There was no trace of hesitation in her presence, no signal of seeking approval or recognition. Even her stillness felt intentional, as if every part of her had been refined through time rather than abandoned by it. "You have changed," Jason said finally. Though the words felt insufficient the moment they left his mouth, Emily regarded him for a brief moment longer than before, then responded with quiet clarity. "People do not always change," she said. "Sometimes they simply become who they were when no one was interrupting them." The sentence remained in the air longer than expected, not dramatic, not loud, but precise enough to settle into Jason's understanding without resistance. Daniel Whitmore gently extended his hand toward Emily, signaling a natural transition within the flow of the evening. She turned slightly toward him, and without further acknowledgement, the conversation between past and present reached its natural limit. Jason remained where he was, surrounded by the continued movement of the gala, yet unable to fully re-enter it. For the first time since arriving, he understood that what he had once defined as distance between him and Emily Carter was not measured in years or circumstances, but in something far more permanent. The realization that she no longer existed within the version of the world he had the authority to interpret. Emily Carter remained still for a moment after Daniel Whitmore guided her attention away from Jason Miller, her expression unchanged, as if the brief collision with the past had already been stored away in a part of her mind that no longer required emotional processing. The gala continued around them, yet the energy near their table subtly shifted as guests began to return to their conversations, though many still cast occasional glances in their direction, sensing the quiet weight of something significant without fully understanding it. Jason stood where he had been left, his hands loosely at his sides, trying to regain composure through the familiar language of logic and professional detachment, but every attempt felt slightly delayed, as if his thoughts were no longer responding at their usual speed. He had expected uncertainty from Emily, perhaps discomfort, perhaps even unresolved emotion, but what he encountered instead was something that did not allow him a place in her present tense. Across the room, Emily took a slow step forward beside Daniel, moving with calm intention through the crowd, her presence no longer framed by any association to Jason, but entirely defined by the environment she now occupied. Daniel spoke softly as they walked, not directing her, but aligning with her pace, mentioning upcoming discussions with international investors scheduled for the following week in Chicago and London. Emily responded briefly, her voice steady, offering only what was necessary, as though her attention was no longer divided between past and present, but fully anchored in forward motion. Meanwhile, Jason attempted to reconnect with familiar faces nearby, exchanging polite remarks, but his focus repeatedly drifted back to where Emily had been standing, as if the space itself still held an unanswered question. At one point, a senior executive approached him, speaking about recent market adjustments and portfolio performance, but Jason struggled to fully absorb the details, his responses slower than usual, measured in ways that felt unfamiliar to him. He excused himself shortly after, citing a brief need for air, and stepped toward one of the large windows overlooking the city. Outside, Manhattan stretched into the night, its lights scattered like distant reminders of motion and ambition, yet Jason found no comfort in the view. Behind him, the sound of the gala continued uninterrupted, but within him, something had shifted beyond simple recognition. He replayed the moment Emily had spoken, not with resentment or pleading, but with calm certainty, and that tone began to separate itself from the version of her he had preserved in memory. That version had once been defined by proximity to him, by shared routines and expectations, by a life that had felt structured and contained. The woman he had seen tonight carried none of that weight. She did not look like someone who had returned. She looked like someone who had never needed to leave anything behind in order to move forward. As Jason stood there, Daniel Whitmore's name surfaced again in conversations behind him, followed by subtle references to global investment influence and strategic expansion. It was not the name itself that unsettled him, but the context in which it appeared effortlessly attached to Emily Carter. The realization did not arrive with drama, but with accumulation, like small pieces aligning into a picture he had not intended to complete. Eventually, Jason turned back toward the room, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a need to confirm that what he had seen was not a distortion of expectation. From a distance he saw Emily again, now engaged in conversation with Daniel and a group of influential guests, her posture unchanged, her attention fully present without division. There was no indication that she was performing or adapting. She simply belonged in that space in a way that no longer required explanation. Jason remained at the edge of the room, no longer part of the flow of conversation, no longer the center of his own assumptions. For the first time, he understood that the distance between them was not something time had created. It was something he had never known how to measure in the first place. Memory did not return as Jason Miller stood near the edge of the gala, watching the center of the room as if it now belonged to a different reality than the one he had entered only an hour earlier. The conversations around him continued in polished fragments, investors discussing projections, executives exchanging forecasts, yet none of it reached him in the same way it once did. His attention kept returning to Emily Carter, who remained composed in the middle of the room beside Daniel Whitmore, as though the space itself had reorganized its meaning around her presence. Jason tried to reconstruct the timeline in his mind, searching for the version of events that made sense, the version where she remained within the boundaries of what he had once known. But each attempt collapsed under the weight of what he was now observing. Emily was not reacting to the room was reacting to her. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle adjustments of attention, in pauses before speech, in the way people oriented themselves when she shifted even slightly. Jason noticed that Daniel Whitmore rarely spoke without first ensuring Emily's attention was aligned with his, not out of control or authority, but out of recognition of her influence within the same space. That detail unsettled Jason. More than anything else, it suggested not proximity but partnership. Not support but equivalence. At one point, a senior financial strategist approached Daniel and Emily, presenting a brief update on upcoming global investment negotiations. The conversation was quiet, efficient, and professional, yet Jason could clearly see that Emily was not being informed as an observer. She was being consulted as a decision-maker. Each sentence directed toward her received a measured response, brief but precise, as though her input carried weight that required no justification. Jason's thoughts drifted backward despite his effort to remain present, returning to a time when he had once viewed her as secondary to the structure of his own ambitions, someone who existed within the periphery of his decisions rather than the center of them. That memory no longer matched the woman standing across the room. It felt outdated, incomplete, almost like a misunderstanding he had never corrected. As the evening progressed, Daniel and Emily moved toward a quieter section of the venue where private discussions were being held among select attendees. Jason followed at a distance without consciously deciding to, stopping only when he reached a point where he could no longer justify his presence without invitation. From there, he observed as Emily listened to a presentation regarding a cross-border investment expansion strategy. The presentation ended, and instead of deferring to others, Emily asked a single question about long-term structural risk exposure in emerging markets. The question was simple in form but sophisticated in implication, and the room responded with immediate attention. Jason recognized that reaction. It was the same kind of silence that followed someone who had already been validated by results rather than expectation. Daniel Whitmore answered her question without hesitation, his tone calm, acknowledging her concern while expanding on its implications. There was no correction, no clarification of authority, only alignment. Jason felt something shift again, not in emotion but in understanding. He was no longer witnessing a reunion or a confrontation. He was witnessing a system that functioned without requiring him to define it. Later, as the discussion concluded and attendees began to disperse into smaller groups, Emily briefly excused herself and stepped toward one of the quieter balconies overlooking the city. Jason found himself moving in that direction as well, not with urgency, but with a need he could not clearly articulate. When he reached the balcony entrance, he paused, seeing her standing there alone, the city lights stretching endlessly behind her. For a moment he considered turning away, but something held him in place. Emily did not turn immediately when she sensed his presence. She remained facing the skyline, composed still, as if she already understood the nature of what would follow. Jason finally spoke, his voice lower than before, carrying less certainty than he intended. "I did not realize how far you had gone," he said. The words felt insufficient even as he said them. Emily remained silent for a moment, then replied without turning, her tone steady and calm. "You did not need to realize," she said. "It was never something you were meant to measure." The answer did not carry resentment, nor explanation. It simply closed a gap that Jason had assumed still required interpretation. Behind them the gala continued, but on the balcony, the distance between who they had been and who they had become no longer felt like something that could be crossed through understanding alone. It felt final in a way that required no further confirmation. The silence between Emily Carter and Jason Miller on the balcony lasted longer than either of them needed to acknowledge, stretching into the cold night air of Manhattan where the city lights below flickered like distant reflections of decisions made far away from consequence. Jason stood a few steps behind her, uncertain whether proximity itself was still permitted in the space she now occupied. Emily remained facing the skyline, her posture unchanged, as if the conversation that had just ended inside the gala had already been filed away into something no longer requiring emotional response. Jason finally exhaled, slower than usual, trying to steady a sense of reality that no longer seemed familiar in its structure. "I spent a long time believing I understood the choices I made," he said carefully, his voice carrying less certainty than he intended. Emily did not turn immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, measured, and without interruption from the past. "Understanding and accepting are not the same thing," she replied. The sentence landed without force, yet it shifted something in Jason that he could not immediately name. He looked at her, searching for hesitation, for fracture, for any trace of the person he once believed he had known completely. But there was none. Instead there was stillness that felt deliberate, not empty. Below them, Manhattan moved in its constant rhythm of traffic and light, indifferent to the conversation unfolding above it. Jason took a step closer, then stopped again, as if the boundary between them was no longer visible but still instinctively respected. "When I left," he said after a pause, "I thought I was choosing something better for my life." Emily finally turned her head slightly, enough for him to see her profile against the glow of the city. Her expression remained unchanged, not softened, not sharpened, only present. "People often believe that clarity comes at the moment of departure," she said. "But clarity usually comes much later, when nothing can be changed by it." Jason absorbed the words without responding immediately, the weight of them settling into a space that felt unprepared for reflection. For a brief moment, the noise of the gala behind them faded further, replaced by the quiet distance between two versions of a shared past that no longer aligned in meaning. Jason studied her carefully, noticing not only the absence of emotion he once expected, but the absence of need. She did not look like someone revisiting history. She looked like someone who had already completed it. "Did I matter at all in how you became this?" he asked finally, the question emerging without full intention, revealing more about him than he may have realized. Emily remained silent for a moment longer than before, then replied with quiet precision. "You were part of the life I left behind," she said, "but not part of what I built afterward." The distinction was not delivered as punishment. It was delivered as fact, without emphasis, without invitation for interpretation. Jason nodded slightly, though the gesture felt more like acknowledgement of distance than agreement. Behind them, the glass doors to the balcony opened briefly as another guest stepped out, but quickly retreated upon sensing the weight of the moment. Emily turned her attention back to the skyline, her presence unchanged, anchored in something that no longer required explanation. Jason followed her gaze for a moment, seeing the city not as a place of memory, but as a structure of continuous movement that no longer paused for individual reflection. He realized then that what he had once considered absence in her life had never been absence at all. It had been transformation without witness. And in that realization there was no anger left, only a quiet recognition that the version of her he had once defined no longer existed anywhere except in his own memory. The night continued without interruption, and on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, the distance between them no longer felt temporary or negotiable, but fully realized in a way that neither time nor explanation could reverse. After the conversation on the balcony, Emily Carter did not carry the moment with her as Jason Miller did. For her, it did not linger as confusion or emotional weight, but as something already integrated into a larger understanding of how distance between people can exist without needing resolution. When she returned inside the gala, the transition was seamless, as if stepping from one controlled environment into another that required no adjustment. Daniel Whitmore was waiting a short distance away, engaged in a quiet discussion with two senior financial advisors, but his attention shifted toward her the moment she approached. There was no question, no interruption, only recognition. "Everything is on schedule for the London Review," Daniel said calmly, as if continuing a conversation that had never been paused. Emily nodded slightly, her focus already shifting toward the next sequence of responsibilities, rather than the encounter she had just left behind. "We will need to adjust the exposure parameters for the Asian portfolio," she replied, her voice steady and precise, carrying no residual distraction. Daniel acknowledged the point without hesitation, as if her input was not supplementary but foundational. Around them, the gala began to transition into its final phase, with smaller groups forming and conversations narrowing into more private exchanges. Emily moved through these spaces without resistance, her presence no longer drawing attention through novelty, but through quiet certainty. She was no longer being observed as someone with a past that needed interpretation. She was being engaged as someone whose decisions influence present outcomes. Jason Miller, meanwhile, remained near the outer edge of the main hall, no longer actively participating in conversations that once defined his sense of belonging. The energy of the evening had not changed, but his relationship to it had. He observed Emily from a distance at times, not continuously, but in brief moments where his attention returned involuntarily. Each time he looked, he noticed something slightly different in how others responded to her. It was not admiration in the traditional sense, nor curiosity. It was alignment. People did not approach her with questions about who she was. They approached her with clarity about what she represented in their decisions. At one point, Jason overheard a brief exchange between two executives discussing a pending multi-billion-dollar infrastructure agreement, and Emily's name appeared not as context, but as authority. That detail settled into him more deeply than anything she had said directly. It suggested that her influence did not depend on visibility. It operated independently of recognition. As the evening neared its conclusion, Daniel Whitmore and Emily were invited to a private closing discussion with a small group of global investors. Jason was not part of that circle. He watched from a distance as they moved toward a separate section of the venue, where the lighting was softer and the conversations more controlled. Before entering the space, Emily paused briefly, not to look back at him, but to adjust her attention forward, as if confirming alignment with what came next rather than what had already passed. Jason realized then that she did not move through rooms with reference to memory. She moved through them with reference to direction. The realization did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as structure. It reorganized how he understood everything he had witnessed that night. He had assumed the encounter on the balcony represented the center of meaning, but now he understood it had only been a moment within a larger continuum that no longer required his participation. When the doors closed behind Emily and Daniel, Jason remained in the main hall, surrounded by the final remnants of an event that was already concluding without him. The guests around him began to disperse, conversations fading into logistical remarks about departures and schedules, but Jason stayed still for a moment longer than necessary. For the first time, he did not try to reinterpret what he had seen. He simply accepted that what had unfolded was not a return of the past, but the continuation of a future that no longer included his perspective as relevant input. The final private discussion room was quieter than the main hall, insulated by thick glass walls that softened the remaining sounds of the gala into a distant, indistinct hum. Inside, Emily Carter stood with Daniel Whitmore and a small circle of senior investors, each of them carrying the calm precision of people, accustomed to decisions that moved across continents rather than moments. The atmosphere was no longer social. It was structural. A projection screen displayed global financial frameworks, long-term infrastructure forecasts, and capital allocation models that spanned multiple regions. Emily listened without interruption, her attention fully anchored in the present analysis, as if the earlier encounter with Jason Miller had already been filed away into a separate layer of time. When she spoke, her voice carried clarity that did not seek validation. The projected volatility in the emerging market segment suggests a phased adjustment rather than immediate reallocation, she said, her words measured and precise. One of the senior analysts nodded, immediately adjusting the parameters on the display. Daniel Whitmore observed her without comment, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully aligned with her reasoning. Jason Miller was not present in that room, yet his presence still lingered in a different form, not as an active force, but as a reference point that no longer carried weight. He remained in the main hall, where the last clusters of guests were beginning to disperse. Conversations had shifted from strategic discussions to polite conclusions, the kind that signal the end of influence for the evening. Jason stood near one of the emptying tables, holding a glass he had not touched in several minutes, his thoughts no longer connected to the rhythm of the event around him. He replayed fragments of the night not as emotional memory, but as structural evidence he was still trying to categorize. Emily Carter was no longer a figure within his personal history. She functioned within systems that operated independently of him. That realization no longer surprised him. It settled. A senior executive approached briefly, offering a courteous farewell and a standard remark about future collaborations. But Jason responded with delayed formality, his focus divided between external interaction and internal recalibration. When the executive left, Jason remained still, looking toward the direction where Emily had disappeared earlier with Daniel Whitmore. He understood now that the separation he felt was not physical. It was informational. He no longer had access to the same level of context that defined her current reality. Meanwhile, in the private room, the discussion reached a natural conclusion. The investors began to gather their materials, nodding in agreement as final projections were confirmed. Emily reviewed the last adjustment on the screen, then closed her tablet with a calm, deliberate motion. There was no sense of completion in her expression, only continuity, as if each finished discussion naturally led into the next without interruption. Daniel Whitmore turned slightly toward her as the others began to exit. "We will proceed with the revised structure for the London Review," he said. Emily nodded once. "And we should maintain flexibility in the cross-regional allocations until the next quarterly assessment," she added. Daniel acknowledged the point without hesitation. There was no need for further validation between them. Their understanding functioned without explanation. As they exited the room, Emily walked beside him through the quieter corridor leading back toward the main hall. The gala was nearly over, with staff beginning to reset the space for departure. Jason was still there when they reappeared at the edge of the hall, though he did not immediately move toward them. He simply watched as Emily and Daniel approached the exit area, surrounded briefly by final greetings from organizers and executives. Emily's interactions remained brief, efficient, and composed, each acknowledgement delivered without deviation from her calm presence. When she finally reached the exit, she paused only long enough to acknowledge a final exchange of gratitude from one of the hosts, then continued forward without turning back. Jason observed that moment without interruption. There was no expectation left in him for acknowledgement, no assumption of recognition. Instead, there was only observation. As Emily Carter stepped out of the gala and into the night beyond Manhattan's lights, Jason Miller understood with quiet certainty that nothing about her movement forward required reference to where she had once been, and nothing about his memory of her was capable of defining where she had arrived. The moment Emily Carter stepped out of the gala, the cold Manhattan night wrapped around her without hesitation, as if the city itself recognized her presence as something no longer defined by where she had come from. The glass doors behind her closed softly, sealing away the final echoes of the evening, but she did not pause. Daniel Whitmore walked beside her at a steady pace, their steps aligned without need for coordination, moving toward a black car already waiting at the curb with its engine running quietly. The driver opened the door without speaking, and Emily entered first, followed by Daniel, both settling into silence that felt natural rather than empty. Inside the vehicle, the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, stretching into long streaks of gold and white, as they moved through Manhattan streets that were still alive with late-night motion. Daniel reviewed a tablet briefly, then set it aside, his attention shifting fully to Emily. "The board will want confirmation on the final allocation structure before the London session," he said calmly. Emily nodded slightly, her gaze resting on the passing skyline. "We will finalize it tomorrow morning before market opening," she replied, her tone steady and without hesitation. There was no urgency in her voice, only certainty. Meanwhile, back at the gala venue, Jason Miller remained outside the main exit for several moments after Emily had left. The flow of guests had thinned, cars departing one by one, conversations fading into polite conclusions. Jason did not immediately move. He stood near the edge of the entrance, his expression controlled but distant, as if his mind was still processing the sequence of events that had unfolded over the course of the evening. A passing executive greeted him briefly, offering a standard remark about the success of the event, but Jason responded with minimal acknowledgement, his attention divided between external reality and internal reflection. Eventually, he stepped away from the entrance and began walking down the sidewalk alone. The city around him continued its rhythm without interruption, taxis moving through intersections, distant sirens fading into background noise, people passing without awareness of his presence. Jason looked ahead but did not fully register what he was seeing. His thoughts returned repeatedly to the final image of Emily leaving the building, not as someone exiting a past life, but as someone continuing forward without interruption. That realization had no emotional clarity attached to it. It was simply structural. It redefined the assumptions he had carried for years without him noticing when they began to collapse. Inside the vehicle, Emily remained silent for a longer stretch as they moved toward the private residence arranged for her stay. Daniel did not interrupt the silence. Instead, he reviewed brief updates on upcoming engagements, occasionally adjusting notes with quiet efficiency. After several minutes, Emily spoke without turning her head. "There is no need to escalate the European restructuring proposal beyond the current phase until we see the next quarter indicators," she said. Daniel glanced at her, then nodded once. "Agreed," he replied. The conversation ended there, not because it lacked importance, but because further discussion was unnecessary. The car continued through the city, crossing bridges and passing illuminated towers that reflected across the river below. Emily finally leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged, her attention no longer divided between past and present, but fully grounded in forward progression. Jason, now several blocks away from the venue, stopped briefly at an intersection, waiting for the light to change. Around him, people continued moving with purpose, each carrying their own direction, but none intersecting with his thoughts. He realized then that what he had witnessed that night was not a reunion, not a confrontation, and not a resolution. It was a transition he had not been part of, and more importantly, one that no longer required his interpretation. When the light changed, he crossed the street and continued walking, not toward understanding, but away from the expectation that understanding was still possible in the same way it once had been. Inside the quiet residence overlooking the Upper East Side, the night had finally settled into a stillness that felt separate from the rest of Manhattan. Emily Carter stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection faint against the glass as city lights stretched endlessly below like a controlled network of distant signals. The car ride from the gala had ended without further discussion, and Daniel Whitmore had moved to a separate room to handle a brief international call, leaving her alone in a space designed for privacy rather than comfort. She did not feel the need to fill the silence. Instead, she allowed it to exist fully, as she often did when processing information that no longer required emotional interpretation. On the table beside her lay a tablet displaying final adjustments to the European investment framework, still open but untouched for several minutes. The events of the evening remained present in her awareness, but not as disruption. They had already been categorized, understood, and integrated into a broader sequence of outcomes that required no further attention. Meanwhile, across the city, Jason Miller walked without clear direction for several blocks before eventually stopping near a quiet intersection where traffic lights changed in slow, repetitive cycles. The energy of the gala had fully dissolved behind him, replaced by the unstructured rhythm of the city at night. He looked upward briefly at the surrounding buildings, their windows illuminated in scattered patterns, each representing lives moving forward independently of his current state of thought. He realized he was no longer trying to interpret what had happened in terms of success or failure. That framework no longer applied. What remained was something more permanent and less negotiable. Emily Carter had not simply changed. She had transitioned into a system of existence that did not require his presence to function. He continued walking eventually, but without urgency or destination, allowing the movement itself to replace the need for analysis. Back in the residence, Daniel returned after finishing his call, placing his phone on the table with quiet efficiency. He glanced toward Emily, who remained by the window. The Asia-Pacific delegation confirmed the revised schedule for next week, he said calmly. Emily nodded once, still looking outward. We will integrate it into the existing timeline without adjustment to the core structure, she replied. Her tone carried no hesitation, no need for reinforcement. Daniel acknowledged the response and moved toward the table to review additional data. There was no sense of interruption in their exchange, only continuation of a process that extended beyond individual moments. Outside, Manhattan continued its constant motion, unaware of the quiet separation unfolding in parallel paths. Jason eventually found himself near a bridge overlooking the East River, stopping briefly as wind moved through the open space around him. The water below reflected fragmented light from the surrounding skyline, shifting continuously without fixed pattern. He stood there longer than intended, not seeking resolution, but allowing the absence of it to settle. The memory of Emily at the gala did not replay as emotion. It remained as observation. She had not looked back when she left. That detail now carried more meaning than any conversation they had shared that night. In the residence, Emily finally moved away from the window and returned to the table, placing her attention on the remaining adjustments required for the upcoming schedule. Daniel worked alongside her quietly, occasionally offering data points that she evaluated without delay. There was no transition from past to present, only forward continuity. Jason, still at the bridge, lowered his gaze to the river and then to his hands, as if confirming something that had already been decided without his input. The night continued for all of them, but no longer along intersecting paths. Each remained within their own direction, defined not by where they had been, but by what they no longer needed to revisit. Morning arrived over Manhattan with a pale, controlled light that filtered through glass towers and reflected off the river in muted silver tones. Inside the Upper East Side residence, Emily Carter was already awake, seated at a long table where the final documents for the London restructuring had been laid out in precise order. There was no sense of anticipation in her expression, only completion of preparation. Daniel Whitmore stood across from her, reviewing the last confirmation notices from the global board. The atmosphere was quiet, but it carried the weight of decisions already accepted across multiple time zones. The board has approved the revised structure without amendment, Daniel said calmly, placing the tablet down. Emily nodded once, her attention briefly scanning the final summary before she closed the file. Then we proceed according to schedule, she replied. There was no pause, no reflection on approval itself. Approval was not a turning point. It was confirmation of alignment that had already existed. Outside, the city had fully awakened, and with it came movement across financial networks that responded to the decisions made hours earlier. In offices across Manhattan, screens updated simultaneously, reflecting structural changes in capital distribution and long-term investment direction. Emily's name appeared in internal briefings not as an advisor, but as the central coordinating authority for the restructuring initiative. It was not announced with ceremony, it was simply recorded as fact. Meanwhile, Jason Miller sat alone in a quieter part of the city, inside a small office space that no longer carried the same significance it once had. A digital screen on his desk displayed financial news updates, but his attention stopped on a single headline that had been quietly released that morning. It referenced a major global restructuring agreement finalized under the leadership framework of Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter, noting her elevated position within the strategic governance structure of multiple international portfolios. Jason did not react immediately. He read the line once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because it confirmed something that had already been forming in him since the night of the gala. Emily Carter had not returned to his life. She had moved beyond any version of it that could be revisited. The headline did not feel like a revelation. It felt like closure written in external language. Back in the residence, Emily stood by the window once more, though this time the city outside felt different. Not because it had changed, but because her relationship to it had finalized into clarity. Daniel approached briefly, handing her a printed confirmation sheet from the board. "Everything is fully aligned," he said. Emily accepted it, glanced at the document, then placed it back on the table. "Maintain this structure for the next cycle," she said. Daniel nodded without hesitation. There was no need for further instruction. Each understood the continuity without explanation. Across the city, Jason closed the news page and leaned back slightly in his chair. There was no frustration, no denial, only recognition that the narrative he had once believed himself part of had already continued without his participation. He looked toward the window beside him where daylight reflected softly against glass buildings, and for the first time, he did not attempt to assign meaning to what he had lost or what had changed. He simply understood that Emily Carter's silence, her absence of return, and her complete forward motion were not actions directed at him. They were simply evidence of a life no longer structured around the need to look back. In the residence overlooking the city, Emily turned away from the window and walked back toward the table where her next set of decisions awaited, each one extending the same forward path without interruption. Nothing required resolution anymore, because everything had already settled into its rightful direction. The city of Manhattan moved through its morning rhythm with the same precision as the global systems now quietly influenced by decisions made the night before, and in a high-rise residence overlooking that structured motion, Emily Carter stood once again by the window, but this time there was no trace of reflection searching for identity, only confirmation of alignment between intent and reality, as Daniel Whitmore entered the room with a final report in hand, and placed it on the table without urgency, acknowledging without words that the cycle they had been working through had reached its intended completion state. And when Emily turned slightly to review the document, her expression remained unchanged, not because she had detached from meaning, but because meaning had already been fully integrated into action. And Daniel spoke calmly, saying the board has finalized all remaining confirmations, and the restructuring framework is now fully active across all regions, to which Emily replied with a simple acknowledgement that maintained continuity rather than conclusion, saying maintain execution discipline and no deviation from the established parameters. And Daniel nodded once as if that instruction was not new information but the final reaffirmation of a structure already understood at every level, while across the city Jason Miller sat in silence in a space that no longer felt connected to any trajectory he could influence. The morning light entering his office without warmth, reflecting off a screen that no longer held uncertainty but clarity, he had not expected to feel so neutral. As he reviewed the final public release regarding the International Restructuring Initiative and Emily Carter's formal recognition within the global strategic framework, and for the first time he did not search for emotional interpretation within it, because there was none left to extract, only confirmation that the distance between what he once assumed and what had actually unfolded was not measured in time but in transformation. And he leaned back slightly as the realization settled that her absence from his present was not an event that had occurred but a condition that had already been established long before he became aware of it. While in the residence, Emily moved away from the window and returned to the table where her schedule for the next cycle had already been organized with exact precision across multiple time zones, and Daniel prepared to leave after a brief final exchange, saying everything is now stable across all divisions, to which Emily responded only with a quiet affirmative that carried no emotional weight because it no longer needed to. And as he exited the room, the silence that remained was not empty but complete, structured by decisions that no longer required validation. And somewhere across the city Jason closed the final report and did not reopen it, instead standing and walking toward the window of his office where the skyline stretched in controlled layers of glass and steel, and for the first time there was no attempt to reconstruct a narrative that placed him within her direction, because he finally understood that Emily Carter had not walked away from him in a single moment. She had simply continued forward into a system of existence where looking back was no longer part of the architecture. And that understanding did not bring collapse or relief, only final clarity, as the morning continued for both of them in separate trajectories that would never intersect again, not because of distance, but because one of them had already become something that no longer required return, and the city moved on beneath them as if confirming silently that some stories do not end with confrontation or reunion, but with irreversible forward motion where only one truth remains constant, that she did not come back because she never needed to, she simply became what the past could no longer reach.